Thanks, Colin. So I have a small confession. As Colin accurately says, all speakers lie. And if you thought that I'll be speaking about R, that is the big lie. I'm not going to speak about any data science in particular, partly because I don't do data science that often anymore. There's a tiny bit I do for internal analysis, but nothing new. But I thought it is really interesting to think about what I've learned from product management in the past more than 20 years and how you can use that in your data science and improve your own projects by thinking of it as a product. So it'll be helpful to think in that context about, well, let's define product management first, and why should you care? And if I persuade you to care, then what should you go do next? I'll give you some resources. So my own journey starts way before in the late 90s. I was product manager for a handheld series of PDAs by Psion Computers, and it's probably only Tim and myself who remember that, because these computers were super popular, especially in the UK back then. And then, of course, Palm Pilot came about, and everything had. All of that evolved into what we call smartphones these days. But about 10 years ago, I worked on Revolution R Open, and then we went into Microsoft. That became Microsoft R Open. That was my product. And we invented, David Smith and myself invented MRAN. And of course, MRAN is no longer a thing. It's now all the next, the best alternative these days is the package manager by Posit. And that's the type of thing I've been working on more recently. At Posit, I have product managed Workbench. And if you're not familiar with Workbench, our Studio IDE and VS Code is part of that. It's a commercial offering that many of our customers use. And I have introduced technical account management into the organization. And much of what I'll be speaking about in this talk, I have actually used in that context. And I've been doing other general items like licensing and packaging and pricing, the type of things that are not software engineering and not development, but only the product manager will typically care about. So what is product management? And pretty much any definition you'll come across looks at trying to define product management in the context of a product lifecycle, from initial idea, building a prototype, building a proof of concept, finding the first user, which is hard, and then finding the second user, which is even harder. So that whole journey from getting people to adopt it and finally in maintenance mode, and it is very possible that people will stop using it and move to the next thing, as I have learned myself. So this cycle, the adoption curve, quite a famous curve. You'll see it in many textbooks. One of them is Crossing the Chasm by Geoffrey Moore, where he basically says there's a set of innovators that will go to a lot of trouble to use your product initially. And then as you go through the adoption cycle, people start caring about different things. And they will, especially towards the early and late majority, they care much more about performance and ease of use, not so much the functionality that you built initially. But the question is, how do you do that? And how are you going to do that for your own app or your quarter doc or whatever it is that you're building? How do you persuade people to do that? I like this framework of thinking about a value proposition to think about how customers will be using your product and how they go about doing their activities and how your product and service match that. And it starts with listing what are frequently called jobs to be done. I'll speak about that in more detail in a minute, but jobs to be done really is the essence of the activity that that user wants to achieve with a solution. And in the current way of doing that, they will experience several pain points, and there may be some things that they want to gain that the current way does not give them. So if you can effectively identify these these pain points and what people may want to gain, and you then design your project, your product, or your service to relieve the pain and to enable that gain to come to the forefront. Then you may have the possibility of having a product that people will want to use. I mentioned jobs to be done. If you want to research this a little bit more, it comes from work by Clayton Christensen and Bob Mester. Clayton is, I believe, still at Harvard Business School, and I first came across him in a very famous book, The Innovator's Dilemma. But jobs to be done describes how you go beyond, what is beyond the superficial activity, and what's the functional and social and emotional content or component of what people want to do. The famous example that they use is they researched how people buy milkshakes for a fast food chain. And if I think about milkshake, it's probably something creamy and chocolatey, most likely. What's the emotional component of that? Well, it's some component of satisfaction or soothing, or whatever you want that to be. But it turns out that people buy milkshakes for breakfast. And that makes no sense until you realize, well, the job to be done here is not just an emotional reward. The job to be done in that case is, I want to eat something on the move. And this work was done in America, where I think it makes more sense. People drive and they don't, eating a breakfast bar or something or a sandwich leaves a lot of crumbs in your car. So having something that doesn't make a mess actually makes sense in that context, but only if that milkshake is not full of cream and chocolate, but maybe a bit more healthy. That's the origin story. The point is, it's not the product, it's not the job to be done, it's the underlying function of what they want to achieve. And that may help you think differently about what you want to achieve with your data science project. So how do you do that? Well, you list the activity that you want to complete, or the user completes. You look at how they do that right now. You identify the pain points and what they can gain by doing something differently. And I'll come back to this in a second, but I want to make a segue to product strategy. And this is one of these nebulous terms what does it actually mean? So product strategy for me is, what's the sequence of outcomes that you have once you know what your customer needs and once you know what you want to build? How do you sequence that in a way that makes sense for everybody involved, the customer as well as your organization? So you have to go and think about who's your target customer, what's the context in the market, what's the alternatives that they have, and what is unique in your solution that satisfies the user need, and what's unique compared to everything else. So if you take these components and you think about that and you combine that with the jobs to be done work that you've already done, then you can create a value proposition statement that looks a bit like this formula that I have here. For my target customer with a specific problem, my product provides a distinctive solution that's unique to compare to alternatives. And by the way, it fits with what my organization's aims are. So in other words, can I do this in a cost-effective and sustainable way that means I can continue to provide this not just next week, but next month and as long as it needs to take. So for example, if I try and apply this to, let's say, the RStudio IDE, who of you using RStudio? The majority. There are alternatives. There are some couple of good ones. Well, maybe one decent one. But for RStudio, or for people who want to code in R, and if R is their primary language, then RStudio IDE is by far the most helpful and easy and complete way of getting that data science task done. And yes, what are the alternatives? Well, maybe VS Code, maybe you have something else. If you were using Python, you would be using maybe Spider or Jupyter Notebooks or something else. But our users don't tend to do that. And yes, in the case of our studio, that's an open source project, but we have bundled that as part of Workbench, so there is a way of funding that so it becomes sustainable. So I want to challenge you to think about what's the value proposition of the project you are working on, and how does that satisfy the needs of your audience in the same way. And I'll come back to that in a second, but just one final thought about what product management is. Marty Kagan is one of the big spirits in writing about product management, and he defines the ideal team that builds products as consisting of 3 people. And you can tell his book was written pre-COVID because he recommends that these people are in the same office, in the same room. And those people are the product manager, a designer, and your development lead. And they think about different things. So the dev lead will take care of all the software engineering, in our case, and the version control, and training people up, and all the good things you need to have about good software products. Your designer needs to think about what's the user experience, the user interface design, the look and feel, all of that, and is it easy to use? Do people understand? Can they get the tasks done? And the product manager thinks pretty much of everything else. How do I identify what people actually need? How do they find this? How do I package this up in a way that they can use and make use of and get updates and so on? So, why should you care about anything that I just said? Well, I want to challenge you to think of yourself in your data science context as a product manager. So think of your app as a product. And if your app is a product, then your internal audience is your customer. And maybe your audience is not just internal to your organization. Maybe you are doing a lot of open source work and it's people out there. You have to convince those people to change their behavior. Whatever the way is that they get the information right now, you want to convince them that there was a better way. And the cost for them of changing their behavior, that's the price. And there's April Dunford in 2 very excellent books that I highly recommend, Obviously Awesome and Sales Pitch. She writes that the biggest obstacle to adoption is inertia. So how do you overcome that? So how do you persuade your users that it's worth switching to something else? So maybe this is something a little bit close to what you do. How do you persuade your users to stop using Excel and PowerPoint and start using your Shiny app? Right? Is this something familiar to you? Yes. Well, I want to suggest 2 things. One is talk to them before you start building it, which is maybe a little bit opposite to how much of us will approach open source. Famously in open source, you scratch your own itch by contributing to an open source project, right? So I suffer from this. I build something because I think I can get this information easier in a Shiny app than I can get it out of Salesforce. But that does not mean that anybody else will use it. So go and speak to people before you invest too much time in building this application. And yet don't build it for you. Make sure that you put yourself into the mind or the mind space of your audience. What do they care about? And then go and do what I call the 10x better exercise. To get people to switch behavior, let's imagine that on some dimension you need to be 10 times better than the competing alternatives. But 10 times better at what? Is that 10 times more accurate, more reliable, easier to use, easier to share, easier to comment on? What exactly does 10 times better mean? Now, there are multiple ways you can use the 10x exercise. One is, in what I've just described, what is 10x better for the user? But for a product, it's also, how can I get 10x the number of users? How can I get 10x market share? How can I be 10x more productive or 10x more cost effective? How can I build my team to be 10 times bigger than it is to support this product that I'm using? So go and think about what it is you want to achieve and what does 10x look for you? And then additional things, as you start growing and maturing your solution, there are some other things you may want to go and think about at larger scale eventually. So primary is make sure you understand the customer. How do you do that? Well, through a combination of qual and quant research. So go and do the interviews, focus groups, observe how they do that. Do a screen recording, ask somebody to use your app, do a recording or make a recording of how they do that and see, do they click the buttons in the way that you were expecting them to click? What do they find difficult? And what are their suggestions for you to improve that? Or what have you missed in that approach? And you can scale it out broader by running all kinds of surveys and questionnaires if you want to have a slightly more quantitative insight into how many people are struggling with a specific thing. So that's all the what I would call the inbound activity. The inbound is how do I absorb information about what customers want, but you also want to be outbound through all kinds of forums and make sure they can get help and updates. All the things you're familiar with. Mailing groups maybe in the past, these days Slack and Discord, and maybe you use social media, YouTube, or whatever the popular thing is. Make sure they know where to find updates, how to download your latest version, and how to contribute. I tried to think of a few examples of data science projects that turned into what I would consider to be products. Of course, I could have listed all the things we do, but I think there are many excellent examples in addition. So data table, I think, is almost a product. When Matt Dell, who used to see him frequently in London when he still lived here, he joined H2O maybe 5 or 10 years ago, and his life has clearly moved on because you're probably familiar that about 6 months ago the project came to a point where people wanted to contribute, but it was difficult. So there was a big undercurrent of GitHub discussions about how do they change maintainership of that project. Matthew Dell was very cooperative, and there's now a whole new set of maintainers. So this data table has moved way beyond the inventor and the first maintainer to a much bigger group of people, and it's extremely widely used. Our Open Sky is a bit different. It's not so much a single package, but a collection of activities done by Kartik Ram and others. And they have funding and they have people working on this full time. And my third example, H2O.ai, some of you may use that. They have many components to what they do, but at the essence, H2O was a way to do auto machine learning at scale. And I never knew this, but Erin Liddell, who was the chief data scientist at H2O until very recently, about last month or so, the core essence of H2O was her PhD project. So what I want you to take away from that is that your project, the thing that you're doing for your PhD or the app you're building for COVID or whatever it is you're working on may well get a life way beyond what you think it is right now. So that's why I want to encourage you to think about product management principles in your work. And finally, I promise to leave you with some resources. I want to list some books, and a podcast, and one product handbook. I've mentioned some of these already. Most people, if you ask them for a recommendation for a product management textbook, will point you to Inspired by Marty Kagan. Kagan also wrote other books, Empowered. There's a new one on breaking the mold on team product management teams. I find his books a really good inspirational summary of what product management is, but it's quite high level. It's not going to tell you the nitty-gritty of how you actually go through it step by step. If you want to have the more pragmatic textbook, it's actually one by LeMay, Product Management, the O'Reilly book, full of good, practical, pragmatic tips. The other three books that I recommend are Teresa Torres on Continuous Discovery Habits. She talks a lot about how you build a system for continuously asking questions about how do people actually go about their task, and how can you match that. Value proposition design, I quoted from in that slide, that matches the pain points and the gain points. Wonderful full color book with cartoons, but again very pragmatic. And sales pitch, it talks about how you can create a compelling presentation to explain to people what it is that you solve and why they should care. If you're not already listening to Lenny's podcast, I find this immensely entertaining. Slightly on the long side, it's about an hour every week. He interviews people that are extremely experienced product managers and software designers, software developers. So I would recommend this. And the one recommendation that actually came from Lenny's podcast is that he interviewed a guy called David DeSanto, who is Chief Product Officer or similar title at GitLab. And GitLab is an interesting organization. They do very many similar things than GitHub does, which is the more famous. It differs in many respects, but GitLab claims to be the world's largest remote-only company. Not only that, they put a lot of their information out there for public consumption. They go as far as recording internal team conversations and putting those on YouTube, which I just find that's scary. I wouldn't do that so easily. But their entire staff handbook is available as a Git repo on GitLab, and that includes their product handbook. So if you want to know how to go and build a product management organization, they have all the job titles, all the promotional paths, everything you want to know what people do. You will find it on there. You can go and clone this repo today and build your own organization like GitLab does. So in summary, we've spoken about what is product management. I've tried to give you my perspective on why I think you should care. Hopefully you do find this intriguing, and I gave you some resources. And that takes us into Q&A. We have a few minutes, hopefully. If you wanted to, that's the link to the slides, including the recommendations and everything, if you want to go and have a look.